Hey, my name is Phil. I'm with Milligan College, and I want to welcome you to video devotion number 8 from X-Ray Vision, where we're going to be in a whole new book looking at a whole new hero. It's 1 Kings 17, and today we meet Elijah. Elijah's coming along about 150 years or so after David, around 870 BC, and things have changed a lot since the time of David. David eventually becomes king, and then he turns the kingdom over to his son Solomon, who has an even greater reign and builds the temple. But Solomon makes some bad choices. There are some consequences, and his son Rehoboam, who's David's grandson, becomes the king, but the king over both Israel and Judah for a very, very, very short time. A rebellious man from Solomon's day named Jeroboam stages a rebellion and takes over the northern 10 tribes that become known as the Kingdom of Israel, whereas Rehoboam reigns over the 2 southern tribes that become known as the Kingdom of Judah. And Elijah lands in that northern kingdom of Israel during a particularly bad time with a particularly bad king named Ahab. We're going to meet him for just a second in 1 Kings 17, but we'll get to know him a little bit more in the chapters that follow, along with his even wickeder wife, Jezebel. And so Ahab gets the news from Elijah that there's going to be a drought. Now, if you studied James last year in Bible Bowl, you may remember in chapter 5 this very incident being alluded to when we're told that Elijah prayed that it wouldn't rain, and it didn't rain, and then Elijah prayed that it would rain, and it did rain, and we learned about the power of prayer. But Elijah is also learning in real time during 1 Kings 17 about the power of getting away from a guy like Ahab. The Lord sends him into hiding, and he's sent to what we see in this translation of the Bible is called the Wadi Kerith. Okay, now I might not have pronounced that perfectly, but I guarantee you'll probably pronounce it even worse. And so what is a wadi, you ask? Well, it is essentially a valley that's dry during the dry season, but kind of runs like a river or a small stream or brook during the wet season. And so Elijah is sent there. It is right at the Jordan River, just south of the Sea of Galilee. And everything's going great because he's got water. There's still water in the wadi. And he also has some ravens who are bringing him food in the morning and evening. Things are going great until the wadi finally dries up. And the Lord sends him on an even further journey to Zarephath that belongs to Sidon, which is present-day Lebanon. It's all the way out at the Mediterranean Sea, even north of the northern part where Elijah was at the Wadi Kerith. And so there he is. He comes to the city gate, and he meets a widow who is essentially preparing her last dying meal for herself and her son because the famine and the drought that are there. And Elijah, in a way that doesn't seem very compassionate at first, asks her for help. Can I have some water? Okay. Can I have some bread? Well, kind of embarrassing, but we're sort of preparing our very last meal because we're about to die. And Elijah gives her good news from the Lord, kind of a crazy promise that, the Lord will make it so that that flour and that oil will not run out until the time when there's plenty of oil and flour again. And so she puts her faith in that promise. She shares with Elijah, and sure enough, it comes true. And it seems at this point like everybody's going to live happily ever after. But some time passes. Elijah's staying with the widow and her son in an upstairs room, and all of a sudden the boy falls ill and dies. And the woman, who basically had every intention of seeing her son die previously, now got her hopes up that everything was going to be okay, only to find that her son's going to just die anyway. And not only is this devastating emotionally, relationally, but it's also going to be devastating financially because in that culture, that son is the one who's going to be able to work and to provide for her and for them. And now he's gone. And so the woman, the widow, pleads with Elijah, how could you let this happen? And Elijah pleads with the Lord, how could you let this happen? Well, he brings the boy upstairs, lifeless, dead, and he stretches himself out over him and 3 times pleads with the Lord and the boy's life is restored. Elijah takes him downstairs to the widow, his mother, and she says, "Now I know because of this that you're a man of God and that the Lord's words are true." And so it's kind of a wonderful ending. But what we see here, in my opinion, is a picture of the way that the family of God is supposed to work in any generation. Now, it is not very likely that you are going to be called upon to do miracles with oil and flour, or to do miracles where you stretch yourself out over someone who has died and raise them back to life. But it is a certainty that you're going to be called upon to ask people for help when you need it, and to share and to provide help to others when they need it, even sometimes when you may be going through a hard time yourself. And so it's a beautiful story of a woman in need and her son who share with Elijah, who's in need, and Elijah being used by the Lord to provide for them as they provide for him, and they provide him a place to stay. And during the most awful nightmare of this woman's life, Elijah, through the power of the Lord, restores her son and restores her faith in God. And this is a wonderful thing. It is a picture of how the family of God, the kingdom of God, the church is supposed to work. But one of the questions that we're asking with X-ray vision, with each chapter that we study, is how does this point us to Jesus? We see some great kind of foreshadowing of Jesus' life and his miracles. For instance, the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000, where you only have this really small bit of food that somehow the Lord miraculously multiplies into an amount that just mathematically doesn't add up unless you believe in miracles and the power of the Lord. Okay, but one of the things that we see most clearly during this account of the widow's son being raised is we see a foreshadowing, a premonition, if you will, of the compassion of Jesus. You may remember in several of the gospel accounts, a synagogue ruler named Jairus. He comes to Jesus in desperation because his little girl, a daughter of 12 years old, is dying. And by the time Jesus gets to the house, she's already died. People try to send him away. And Jesus sends them all out, takes Peter, James, and John along with him, and basically raises her to life and gives her back to her parents. But in Luke 7, we see this account in verses 11 and following. We read, "Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, 'Don't cry.' Then he went up and touched the bier they were carrying him on, and the bearers stood still. He said, 'Young man, I say to you, get up.' The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. 'A great prophet has appeared among us,' they said. 'God has come to help his people.' This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country." Just like in 1 Kings 17, in the New Testament Gospels, we see an even more powerful story of a hero who has the ability and the desire to go to people who are dead and to raise them back to life. When I was dead in my transgressions and in my sins, Jesus raised me back to life. And that's exactly what he wants to do for every person who has strayed from God. He holds the power of resurrection in his hand. We see it in the empty tomb. We see it in Zarephath of Sidon, and we see it in a little town called Nain, and in the home of Jairus and his wife and his family. But we also are supposed to see that same compassion, that same resurrection power in your life and my life as we share it with the world. Keep looking at this year's text with X-ray vision. Thanks a lot. I'll see you soon.